There is a number that petroleum engineers in Texas refuse to say out loud in boardrooms anymore. 9%. That's the reservoir level where America's largest oil refining hub can no longer function. Not slower operations, complete shutdown. When Corpus Christi hits 9%, the pumps stop working, the cooling systems fail, and refineries that process 2.2 million barrels per day go dark. 2 weeks ago, I watched the gauge hit 11%. It was the closest this facility has come to total failure since it opened in 1938. Backup water trucks lined the highways like a funeral procession. This morning, a small storm system brought the level back up to 14%. Local news ran headlines saying crisis averted. If you stopped reading there, you would think everything was fine. But the aquifer that feeds this reservoir has been dropping for 6 straight years. One rainstorm did not refill decades of depletion. The math is simple and terrifying. The refineries of Corpus Christi should be deafening. Instead, as I stand at the Valero observation point along Highway 181, what strikes me is the eerie quiet. Where there should be the constant hum of America's industrial might, there is an unsettling stillness. The massive cooling towers that typically release billowing clouds of steam into the Texas sky stand dormant against the horizon. The scale of what we are witnessing is difficult to comprehend. These refineries represent the backbone of America's fuel supply chain, processing crude oil into the gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel that power our nation. But today, many of the intake pipes designed to pull millions of gallons from Corpus Christi Bay sit exposed above the waterline, like industrial relics from a forgotten era. Walking closer to the edge, I can see the water's recession has left a distinct brown ring of salt and industrial residue that stretches for miles around the bay. This stain marks where the waterline used to be, a visual testament to the chronic depletion occurring beneath our feet. What was once covered by 15 feet of water now bakes in the relentless Texas sun, rust forming on critical infrastructure never meant to be exposed to air. Local refinery worker James Cortez, who has spent 22 years at these facilities, stops his truck beside me. He says, "I've never seen it this bad," pointing toward the exposed intake structures. Those weren't built to operate in air. They need to be submerged to function properly. He shakes his head. When those pumps can't pull water, everything stops. Everything. The silence around us is not just unsettling, it is the sound of economic catastrophe waiting in the wings. Nearly $50 billion worth of critical energy infrastructure sits in limbo, dependent on water resources that continue to vanish despite occasional rainfall. The temporary reprieve granted by last week's storm has only masked the fundamental crisis at hand. To truly grasp what's at stake in Corpus Christi requires understanding the sheer magnitude of this operation. The refining complex processes an astonishing 2.2 million barrels of crude oil every day, enough to fill the gas tanks of every vehicle in Texas twice over. This isn't just a regional energy hub, it's a national lifeline. The refined products flowing from these facilities don't just power Texas, they become the jet fuel that allows American airlines to operate flights across the southeastern United States. They transform into the diesel that powers freight trains carrying everything from grain to consumer goods across more than a dozen states. The gasoline processed here ends up in pumps from Florida to Montana, fueling millions of daily commutes and commercial activities. Professor Elena Vasquez, an energy systems expert from Texas A&M University, explains the critical role this complex plays. Corpus Christi isn't just one link in America's energy chain, it's the central processing hub where multiple supply lines converge. When these refineries operate at reduced capacity, it creates ripple effects through the entire national fuel distribution network. The water requirements for this massive operation are equally staggering. Each refinery needs approximately 3,000 gallons of cooling water to process a single barrel of oil. At full capacity, that translates to 6.6 billion gallons flowing through the system every day, enough water to meet the daily needs of a city with 120,000 residents. This water is not optional. Without sufficient cooling capacity, the high-temperature cracking units that transform crude oil into usable fuels cannot safely operate. The physics are unforgiving. inadequate cooling leads to dangerous overheating that can result in catastrophic equipment failure or even explosive conditions. When water levels drop too low, safety systems automatically trigger shutdown procedures. People don't understand that these aren't dimmer switches, explains Richard Garza, a former operations manager at one of the major refineries. When cooling water pressure drops below critical thresholds, the entire system goes into emergency shutdown. We don't get to choose to run at 80% or 50% capacity. Below certain water levels, it's all or nothing. With Corpus Christi representing over 40% of America's Gulf Coast refining capacity, any significant disruption here would send immediate shockwaves through the nation's energy markets. The most vulnerable sectors would be aviation, transportation logistics, and agricultural operations, all dependent on steady fuel supplies at predictable prices. The crisis unfolding today has roots in decisions made more than half a century ago. In August 1962, a team of petroleum engineers and executives from major oil companies gathered in Houston with a single mission. They were to identify the ideal location for what would become America's premier refining complex. Their selection criteria were straightforward. They needed deep water access for oil tankers, proximity to existing petroleum fields, and critically, fresh water for cooling operations. Corpus Christi Bay checked every box, particularly the water requirement. Geological surveys showed the Gulf Coast aquifer beneath the region contained water levels nearly 200 feet higher than today's measurements. They weren't being negligent by the standards of the time, says Dr. Thomas Reynolds, an environmental historian who has studied the development of America's energy infrastructure. The hydrological data showed what appeared to be an essentially infinite water resource. Nobody was modeling long-term aquifer depletion in the 1960s. The original engineering plans I reviewed at the Texas State Archives reveal a fundamental assumption that would eventually threaten the entire operation. Water would always be abundant. Intake pipes were positioned at depths that seemed conservative at the time, but now proved dangerously optimistic. Cooling systems were designed without meaningful recycling capabilities because conservation was not economically justified when water appeared limitless. Former Exxon engineer Robert Kingsley, now 87, was part of the original planning team. He says, "We designed for redundancy in almost every system, backup power, duplicate processing units, emergency response capabilities. But water? We just assumed the aquifer would recharge at the same rate we withdrew from it. Nobody questioned that." The permits issued by Texas regulatory authorities reinforced this flawed assumption. Industrial users were granted virtually unlimited water rights without meaningful monitoring requirements. The regulatory framework, designed for an era of abundance, lacked mechanisms to address systemic depletion. The result was a technological marvel built on a hydrological house of cards. The refineries themselves represent pinnacles of engineering achievement, capable of transforming crude oil into hundreds of essential products through sophisticated chemical processes. Yet they rest entirely on access to a resource that was silently vanishing beneath them. Dr. Reynolds says it is a tragic irony. These facilities can withstand hurricanes, operate through power outages, and process millions of barrels of volatile hydrocarbons safely. But they are completely vulnerable to the slow-motion disaster of water depletion that has been unfolding for decades. The water crisis threatening Corpus Christi did not emerge without warning. As early as 2018, hydrologist Dr. Sarah Martinez was documenting alarming trends in the Gulf Coast aquifer system that supplies the region. Her comprehensive analysis for the Texas Water Development Board painted a disturbing picture of systemic depletion that was accelerating beyond sustainable limits. Dr. Martinez told me the data was unambiguous. She said they were seeing withdrawal rates exceeding natural recharge by approximately 300%. The math was not complicated, she added. Continued extraction at those rates would inevitably lead to critical thresholds being crossed. Martinez's 247-page report, which I obtained through a public records request, included specific projections that have proven eerily accurate. On page 183, a graph showed bay water levels intersecting with what she labeled the critical industrial operation threshold between late 2023 and mid-2024. The actual measurements recorded over the past 6 months have tracked her projections almost perfectly. But the most disturbing aspect of Martinez's work was not her analysis, it was the response it received. Her recommendations were specific and actionable, including mandatory water recycling systems for industrial cooling operations, immediate restrictions on agricultural pumping from the shared aquifer, and investments in alternative cooling technologies for existing and new refineries. These recommendations, clearly marked as urgent in the executive summary, made their way through multiple levels of government. They reached the governor's office, where they were reclassified as long-term planning considerations and effectively shelved. When Martinez testified before the Texas legislature's Musca's Natural Resources Committee in March 2019, industry representatives were ready with counter-arguments. She remembers sitting there listening to lobbyists calling her research alarmist and economically irresponsible. They had their own studies showing sufficient water through 2040, but those models used historical rainfall patterns that were not accounting for changing climate conditions. The hearing transcripts reveal a fundamental clash between scientific projections and economic interests. When Martinez warned that refineries might face operational constraints within 5 years, an industry spokesperson countered that such concerns would unnecessarily alarm markets and potentially impact investments in Texas energy infrastructure. Today, Martinez's vindication comes with no satisfaction. She says being right about this is terrible. She is now helping these same companies develop emergency water sourcing plans that would have been much more effective and less expensive if implemented years ago when we first identified the problem. Her experience highlights a critical failure in how we address slow-moving environmental crises. Systems designed to respond to immediate disasters often prove inadequate when confronting gradual deterioration, even when the ultimate consequences may be equally severe. Understanding the water crisis in Corpus Christi requires grasping a fundamental hydrological principle. Aquifers do not deplete linearly. They follow exponential patterns that accelerate over time. Dr. Victor Hernandez, professor of hydrogeology at the University of Texas, explains the aquifer is like a checking account that receives small, inconsistent deposits while experiencing massive regular withdrawals. For 6 decades, refineries and other users have been making increasingly larger withdrawals, while natural recharge, rainfall percolating through soil layers, has remained relatively constant or even decreased due to drought conditions and land development. The mathematics creates a compounding problem. As water levels drop, wells must be drilled deeper. Deeper wells require more energy to pump the same amount of water, increasing operational costs. The deeper water often contains more dissolved minerals and contaminants, requiring additional treatment before industrial use. This cycle creates a feedback loop where each gallon extracted makes future extraction more difficult and expensive. What began as an economic afterthought, the cost of water for cooling, has now become a critical constraint on operations. The data shows this acceleration clearly. Monitoring wells across the region recorded an average annual decline of 1.3 feet between 1980 and 2000. From 2000 to 2015, that rate increased to 2.7 feet annually. Since 2015, some monitoring stations have recorded drops exceeding 5 feet per year, with the trend continuing to accelerate. Dr. Hernandez says we are witnessing the mathematical inevitability of unsustainable extraction. The system was balanced when human withdrawals were minimal. Industrial-scale pumping disrupted that balance decades ago, and we are now experiencing the consequences of that cumulative imbalance. Adding to this mathematical challenge is the physical phenomenon of subsidence, the gradual sinking of land as water is removed from underlying aquifers. As the water table drops, the soil and rock compress, causing the surface elevation to decrease. This creates a cruel paradox as the land sinks. Facilities originally built at safe elevations above sea level become increasingly vulnerable to flooding and storm surge. Houston has already subsided by approximately 12 feet in some areas due to groundwater pumping, Hernandez notes. Corpus Christi is following a similar trajectory, just a few decades behind. The refineries were built with specific elevation parameters relative to the bay. As the land subsides, those parameters change, creating new vulnerabilities that were not part of the original design considerations. This subsidence also affects the bay itself, making it shallower relative to the ocean. Shallower bays experience greater temperature fluctuations, increased evaporation, and reduced capacity to dilute industrial discharge. All of these factors compound water quality and quantity challenges for the refineries. The mathematical reality creates an inescapable conclusion. Even if all pumping stopped today, the aquifer would take decades to recover to levels seen in the 1960s. With continued extraction, the system moves inexorably toward the 9% threshold, where physical limits will force operational shutdowns regardless of economic consequences. Behind the statistics and hydrological models are thousands of workers whose livelihoods depend on the continued operation of the Corpus Christi refining complex. As water levels drop, their economic security evaporates with it. Miguel Santos represents the human face of this crisis. A cooling system maintenance specialist with 17 years of experience at the Marathon refinery, Santos has witnessed the gradual deterioration of the water situation firsthand. Last month, his regular shift was interrupted by an emergency shutdown triggered by insufficient cooling water pressure. Santos told me at a local diner where many refinery workers gather that he has been through hurricanes, power outages, equipment failures. Those are part of the job. But this is different. This is not something we can fix with parts or overtime. When the water is not there, there is nothing to do but wait and hope. The uncertainty has created palpable tension among the workforce. The Marathon facility has already implemented rotating furloughs, temporary layoffs that keep workers technically employed but without regular income. Santos himself received notice that his work schedule would be reduced to 3 days per week, representing a 40% cut in his income. "I've got a mortgage, 2 kids in college, and a wife whose medical benefits depend on my job," he explains. "We're cutting everything we can, but there is only so much fat to trim from a family budget." The scary part is not knowing if this is temporary or the new normal. The employment impacts extend far beyond the refinery gates. The port of Corpus Christi has laid off 12% of its workforce in the past 6 months, as shipping volume has decreased. Chemical plants dependent on refinery byproducts have reduced production. Service contractors who handle everything from industrial cleaning to equipment maintenance have scaled back operations. Lisa Garza, who operates a food truck that serves refinery workers during shift changes, has seen her business drop by 60%. "When they are running full shifts, I serve about 200 people a day. Last week I barely hit 80, she says. These are not just customers, they are friends. I have known for years who now tell me they cannot afford to eat out at all. Local officials are struggling to respond to the emerging economic crisis. The unemployment rate in Nueces County has increased from 4.2% to 6.8% over the past year, with projections suggesting it could reach double digits if multiple refineries implement extended shutdowns. Community college enrollment has surged as displaced workers seek training for alternative careers, but the transition is not simple. The skills that make someone valuable in a refinery do not necessarily transfer to other industries, says Maria Hernandez, Workforce Development Coordinator at Del Mar College. We are seeing people in their 40s and 50s who have spent decades building specialized expertise, now starting over in completely new fields. The human dimension extends beyond economic impacts. Mental health providers report increasing cases of anxiety and depression among affected workers and their families. Uncertainty about the future, combined with immediate financial stress, creates psychological pressure that ripples through the community. We are seeing classic symptoms of communal trauma, says Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a psychologist with the Corpus Christi Mental Health Coalition. There is anger, denial, bargaining, the stages of grief playing out across an entire economic sector. The difficulty is that unlike a hurricane or flood, there is no clear timeline for recovery. The uncertainty itself becomes a source of ongoing stress. The water crisis in Corpus Christi reveals intricate connections within America's energy infrastructure that remain invisible to most citizens until they fail. The refineries here don't just produce fuel for Texas, they form a critical node in a national supply network that touches virtually every sector of the economy. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, Director of Supply Chain Analytics at the Energy Policy Institute, explains that what makes this situation particularly dangerous is how many essential services depend on steady output from these facilities. The public sees gas prices at the pump, but that's just the most visible impact of a potential refinery shutdown. The connections begin with aviation. The Corpus Christi complex produces approximately 42% of the jet fuel used by major airlines operating throughout the southeastern United States. Delta, American, Southwest, and United all rely heavily on fuel refined at these facilities. When production drops, airlines face both price increases and potential supply constraints that can force operational adjustments. An extended shutdown would force airlines to reroute fuel from other regions, increasing costs and potentially limiting flight schedules. The just-in-time nature of aviation fuel delivery means there's limited buffer in the system for extended disruptions. The rail network represents another critical dependency. Class 1 railroads like Union Pacific and BNSF consume massive quantities of diesel fuel to move freight across the country. Much of that diesel comes directly from Corpus Christi refineries. These same rail lines transport agricultural products, consumer goods, and manufacturing components, creating a double vulnerability where both the transportation system and its cargo depend on steady refinery output. The petrochemical connections extend even further. The refineries produce base chemicals that feed into manufacturing processes for everything from fertilizers to plastics. Farmers in Iowa use fertilizer made with components from Corpus Christi. Car manufacturers in Alabama install plastic components derived from these same facilities. Medical equipment manufacturers produce IV bags and surgical tubing, all connected to this single, water-dependent hub. Dr. Rodriguez notes that the average American doesn't realize how many products in their daily lives originate from these refineries. It's not just what goes in your gas tank, it's the plastic in your phone, the synthetic fibers in your clothing, the packaging around your food, and countless other products. This interconnection creates dangerous vulnerability in our supply chains. When a natural disaster hits a single facility, other regions can typically compensate through increased production. But the water crisis threatens the entire Corpus Christi complex simultaneously, creating a potential choke point that could disrupt multiple supply chains concurrently. The pricing implications are equally concerning. Fuel markets operate on thin margins and rapid price signals. Even temporary disruptions can trigger significant price spikes as traders anticipate supply constraints. These increases then propagate through the economy, affecting transportation costs for virtually all goods and services. Dr. Rodriguez warns that potential price increases would affect literally every product that moves on American roads, rails, or airways. When transportation costs rise, those increases get passed along to consumers through higher prices for everything from groceries to online purchases. The concentration of so much critical capacity in a single water-dependent location represents a strategic vulnerability that extends beyond economics into national security considerations. The Department of Defense relies on these same refineries for jet fuel that powers military aircraft and diesel that moves equipment and personnel. A major disruption would trigger emergency supply protocols that would further strain the civilian system. As the crisis accelerates, a critical deadline looms over the Corpus Christi complex. The current water allocation agreements between the city, the Port Authority, and the refineries will expire on December 31st, 2025. These contracts, negotiated when water appeared abundant, established usage rights that have governed operations for decades. The expiration creates a legal and operational cliff edge. Without new agreements in place, water allocation will default to emergency protocols established by the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ. These protocols prioritize municipal drinking water and essential services above industrial uses, regardless of economic impact. Water rights attorney Gloria Ramirez explains that the regulatory framework was never designed for this scenario. She says the existing permits were issued under assumptions of sufficient supply for all users. When those assumptions fail, the system reverts to prioritization based on public health and safety, not economic contribution. Under the TCEQ emergency framework, industrial users would face mandatory reductions of up to 40% from their historical usage levels. At that level of restriction, operations at multiple refineries would become physically impossible. The Marathon facility, which requires minimum flow rates to maintain cooling system pressure, would likely shut down completely. Valero would operate at less than half capacity. ExxonMobil would face impossible choices between their crude processing and chemical manufacturing operations. These are not arbitrary restrictions, Ramirez notes. They reflect the physical reality of a diminished resource that must be allocated among competing users. Municipal drinking water needs obviously take precedence over industrial cooling, regardless of the economic consequences. What makes this deadline particularly dangerous is the absence of extension mechanisms, or grandfather clauses. Unlike many regulatory frameworks that provide transition periods or hardship exceptions, water rights operate on absolute thresholds. When the resource is not physically available, no legal framework can create water that does not exist. Industry representatives are frantically working to develop alternative solutions before the deadline arrives. Proposed measures include massive investments in water recycling systems, desalination plants to process seawater for industrial use, and even long-distance pipelines to bring water from other watersheds. James Harrington, spokesperson for the Coastal Bend Industry Association, which represents major refineries, says they are exploring every technological option available. But these are not solutions that can be implemented overnight. Desalination at the scale needed requires billions in investment and years of construction. Water recycling systems can reduce consumption, but cannot eliminate it entirely. The economics present their own challenges. Desalinated water costs approximately 5 to 7 times more than traditional freshwater sources. Those increased costs would be passed through to consumers as higher fuel prices, creating economic ripple effects throughout the economy. Meanwhile, the physical reality of the aquifer continues its relentless decline. Current measurements suggest the system will reach the critical 9% threshold sometime between March and August 2026. At that level, the intake pumps physically cannot maintain the pressure needed to operate cooling systems safely, regardless of legal permits or economic considerations. Hydrogeologist Victor Hernandez warns we are approaching the point where physics trumps economics and regulation. Below certain water levels, the infrastructure simply cannot function as designed. No emergency declaration or regulatory exemption can change that fundamental reality. The collision between legal deadlines and physical constraints creates a perfect storm. Even if new water agreements are negotiated, they cannot create water that does not exist. Even if emergency regulations are modified, they cannot overcome the physical limitations of pumping systems designed for water levels that no longer exist. Hernandez says the countdown is not just regulatory, it is hydrological, and at current rates of depletion we are measuring the remaining timeline in months, not years. Standing again at the Valero observation point as this investigation concludes, I watch cooling towers billowing steam against the Texas sky. Today's operations continue as they have for decades, processing crude oil into the fuels and chemicals that power American life. The gauge still reads 14%, just enough above the critical threshold to maintain normal operations. But the brown ring marking the bay's retreat tells a different story. It is a visual reminder of the slow-motion crisis unfolding beneath the surface, literally and figuratively. Each day, the water table drops a little further. Each month, the margin between normal operations and catastrophic shutdown grows thinner. What makes this crisis particularly insidious is its invisibility to the average citizen. Unlike hurricanes or floods that arrive with dramatic intensity and generate immediate response, aquifer depletion happens silently underground. The consequences emerge gradually until sudden thresholds are crossed, turning manageable challenges into existential threats. The refineries of Corpus Christi represent both technological marvel and systemic vulnerability. They demonstrate humanity's remarkable capacity to transform crude oil into hundreds of essential products through sophisticated chemical processes. Yet they also reveal our dangerous tendency to design critical infrastructure around assumptions of resource permanence that prove false over time. Richard Garza, the former refinery operations manager, reflects that they built these facilities to withstand hurricanes, explosions, and terrorist attacks. They hardened them against every threat they could imagine, except running out of water. That seemed impossible. The coming months will determine whether American ingenuity can find solutions before physics forces decisions. Engineers are working frantically on water recycling systems that could reduce consumption by 30 to 40%. Desalination projects are being fast-tracked despite enormous costs. Water conservation measures are being implemented throughout the region. But the fundamental question remains unanswered. Can these efforts outpace the relentless mathematics of depletion? Can technological solutions be implemented at sufficient scale before critical thresholds are crossed? The answers will determine not just the fate of America's largest refining complex, but the stability of energy prices and supply chains across the nation. For now, the refineries continue operations, processing 2.2 million barrels a day into the fuels and chemicals that power modern life. Tankers still arrive at the port, offloading crude oil for processing. Pipelines still carry finished products to markets across the country. The system functions as it has for decades. But beneath this apparent normalcy, the countdown continues. The water gauge does not care about quarterly earnings reports or consumer fuel prices. It responds only to the physics of withdrawal and recharge, a balance that has tilted dangerously toward depletion. The bathtub ring around Corpus Christi Bay keeps rising, marking the retreat of the resource that built an energy empire. And no one, not the engineers, not the executives, not the regulators, has figured out how to make it rain.